In this video, we're going to go over the 4 main categories of heritage language speakers. Just like languages are these huge, complex systems, so is the definition of what a heritage speaker is. I know because I'm a polyglot. I've learned a ton of languages, and now I'm setting out to relearn my own heritage language as an adult. I've also read a few things on this. So we're going to combine the scientific literature with your experience as a person who uses languages. With that, we'll discover what a heritage language is, what a heritage speaker is, and what category you might fall into. And if you're a teacher, there's plenty on this topic for you too. By the end of this video, you'll not only know what category you fit in, but also know how that classification can help you relearn your heritage language. On y va! The first category of heritage language speaker is the broadest and the least based in linguistics. We'll get into definitions that are based more on the language soon, but we're going to start here. Let's see if this sounds like you or somebody you know. This category of heritage speaker is an active part of their community. They participate in their traditions or religions, maybe even on a daily basis. They live with their group of people and maybe even on the land where their language was historically spoken. And they tie their language to their identity, but they don't speak their language. And neither do their parents. Let's call this classification of heritage language learners community members, even though they don't have an official linguistics classification. To them, their heritage language is really important. It's tied to their identity in some way. But for whatever reason, the transmission of that language was lost over generations. Maybe it was war, maybe genocide, maybe even forced migration. Or maybe the dominant language in the area just refused to let them build schools in their language. Unlike other types of heritage language learners we're going to talk about, this group's members weren't bilingual as children, but they were disenfranchised from their language. It was taken from them. In the US or Canada, this means a lot of First Nation or Native American people. Reclaiming their language is not only important for an individual's personal identity, but for that entire group. And they have a lot in common with other types of heritage language users or students, so let's keep going with this list. The second group of heritage language learners are more individuals than an actual group. Again, this group doesn't have an official linguistics classification name, so let's just call them inheritance motivated. They have no direct contact with this language, but it is a family or ancestral language. Maybe their family has lived somewhere else for 100 years and left the language behind. Maybe they don't even know what language specifically their ancestors spoke, only the continent that they came from. They might not even be familiar with their ancestors' traditions or customs. And if they do keep some of those traditions, it's normally really fused with the dominant tradition where they live. So they certainly weren't bilingual as kids, and probably their parents weren't either. We will get to bilingualism in a second though. So for this group of inheritance-motivated students, claiming this language is their heritage language can feel kind of weird or maybe be really hard. Well, you're not really Italian, you're American. Well, if you were really Polish, you'd be able to speak the language. Mais tu es pas vraiment français? Here's the big thing. For this group, their big motivation to learn the language can often be an exploration of themselves, their own identity and who they are. When someone tells them they're not really from a place, no matter what that person's opinions are, it can really hurt this inheritance-motivated person during their language learning journey. It can make them feel like even more of an outsider. And if we promote learning languages because it connects people, then why are we trying to disconnect people from a language? So to recap, we have first the community members who are actively part of the cultures, tradition, and people who originally spoke their language. And then we have the inheritance-motivated individuals who are exploring a language and a culture they're not necessarily in contact with, but they believe was the language and culture of their ancestors. But what about the bilinguals? Or the not so bilinguals? Let's keep going on this list. But if one of those groups sounded like you, tell me in the comments. And if not, when we get to the group that sounds like you, tell me in the comments. This channel is devoted to helping people relearn languages, especially heritage languages. So if I can see who this channel is really speaking to, I can make more content based on that type of heritage language learner. Now, the third definition of a heritage language speaker or user is the most classic and most studied type. The reason this group is so well classified and so studied is because they align with this language linguistically, historically, culturally, and maybe in additional ways. Plus, this group is the easiest to put in a classroom together on a public budget. These heritage language users or students are what we normally call bilinguals, but they're not perfectly bilingual. They make mistakes in their heritage language. They might not be able to read in their heritage language. They're often first or second generation immigrants to a new area, and sometimes third generation, but rarely. They start with this language nice and strong in their early life when along comes a linguistic interruption. For children of immigrants, this was probably elementary school where they went to school in the dominant language, likely English. For children who migrated themselves as kids, that migration was probably the interruption. Suddenly, they're getting all sorts of input from this dominant language, and not very much from the language they spoke when they were little with their family. The language they started off speaking so well when they were little falls apart. Maybe it gets a little weaker, maybe it doesn't fully develop, or maybe it gets way worse. Well, then they're not really bilingual, are they? So if you fall into this category and somebody tells you you're not bilingual, that's because they don't know what bilingual means. In fact, the idea of being bilingual can range from this totally perfect, balanced, kind of mythical bilingual to somebody who can't use the language but can understand it. It's what we call a passive bilingual. So it's extremely important that we don't treat these heritage language learners like they're second language learners. They might not be able to explain the grammatical rules in their language, but they can often use the language to a certain degree like a native. Their experiences and background can bring a ton of richness into lesson plans, a classroom, or even private tutoring sessions. They normally do pretty good in the conversation. They might even be really accustomed to dancing around words they don't know, so a teacher might think they have a much higher level than they do. But they likely can't do things like read or write in the language. And they probably don't have the same specific professional vocab that a lifelong native speaker would have. If you throw them into a classroom with second language learners, it's going to be a mess. And if you throw them into a classroom with the other two groups, the community members or the inheritance motivated learners, it's probably going to be really weird for everyone. We're going to get to the fourth and final category in a second. But so far, just think about how diverse these three groups are and how different their needs could be. If you judge them all based on their ability to write in the language, you might want to put them in the same classroom. They're going to have different experiences they want to share and bring. They're going to have things they already know or maybe know nothing. And they're all going to have different reasons as to why they want to learn, relearn, or improve their language. So lesson plans and classrooms really need to take which of these categories they fall into account. Okay, so fourth and last big linguistics category of heritage language speakers. This category is actually the one that I fall into. We're the people that were bilingual as kids and are now sort of not really bilingual. We've probably forgotten a lot of what we used to know. Or maybe we just never developed that initial language very far to begin with, like my younger brother. But we're still part of our culture, unlike the inheritance-motivated learners. And we do still have some sort of linguistic connection with the language, unlike the community members. But we're not quite as developed as the classical heritage language user. But we are still valid. Again, this category doesn't yet have an official linguistics name, but for this video, we're going to call them the passive heritage language users. No matter how we define passive, maybe we can only understand a few things, or maybe we can understand a ton. Like I said, if you fall into one of these 4 categories, leave it below in the comments. I'm going to reference this for future videos. And honestly, part of the reason that these categories are important is because our relationships with these languages, or our lack of relationship, can be extremely stressful and pretty shameful. We might face shame within our community, but outside of our community, face additional racism. It can be really hard to semi-speak or not really speak a language you identify with. But that doesn't mean it's not your heritage language. There are a lot of people like you. Now, you know how I started off this video by saying there's 4 categories? I may have exaggerated. Before I get into the bonus material, just know that you've hit the linguistics jackpot on YouTube. This video is at the top of a playlist on my channel called Learn About Heritage Languages. Head over there after this bonus content and just fall down that rabbit hole. Plus, hit subscribe so you can fall down a new rabbit hole whenever I post a video.
¿Pero has mentido o qué? ¿Hay 4 categorías o no?
Yes and no. One of the many cool things about linguistics and languages is that many of the questions we have haven't been solved yet. Humans are too weird and cool to be able to categorize super neatly. These 4 classifications are some of my favorite because they make the most sense in the classroom. They're practical and applicable, but don't kick anyone out of the Heritage Language Club. But there are still debates going on about what exactly these definitions should be, and they're definitely worth exploring. Inside each one of these categories, there's a huge spectrum of individual categories, and these categories also overlap. Plus, there are probably other categories that just haven't been explored by linguists yet. But of course, there's other linguists that argue that unless you're already bilingual, you're not a heritage language speaker or learner. Like I said, it's all worth exploring, but probably in another video because this one's getting long. But here's the important thing. If you're curious about exploring your heritage language and your identity is part of your motivation for learning or relearning it, go with that. One of the ways you can use your little category to help bolster yourself up during your language learning, relearning, or improvement is that it should be validating for you to know that you're not alone. Even if some teacher doesn't think you're really X because you don't know how or you don't have why, it doesn't matter. That just means they don't know about this. Many linguists understand that these categories are real and they are important. There is space for you in the language learning world. There's space for you in your culture. And if you do decide to learn, relearn, or improve your heritage language, you'll be making the world a little better. And your ancestors would be proud. All of the academic resources that were cited during this video can be found on my website, relearnalanguage.com. You can also find more ways to apply these labels in the classroom, whether you're a teacher or a student, over there. And like I said, after this video, head over to the playlist on my channel and fall down the rabbit hole. I'd love to make your language learning journey more fun and a little less alone. Subscribe here if you're a student or teacher who wants more information about heritage languages and how the linguistics of heritage languages can help improve somebody's learning process.